A horror streamer launches a game sent by a fan, thinking it's a joke. But the game is a perfect replica of his room, and his character starts mirroring his every move in real time. The joke ends when a door appears on screen that doesn't exist in his apartment, and his entire chat begins to spam one command: look behind you. 10,000 pairs of eyes were watching him this evening. For Alex, known online as Voidwalker, it was just another Wednesday. The glow from 3 monitors painted his face in shifting blues and purples as he dispatched another pixelated monstrosity with a practiced, easy smirk. He was the master of this digital domain, a charismatic guide through manufactured nightmares for an audience that hung on his every word. His voice, a smooth and confident baritone, filled the small room, a constant stream of jokes and commentary that kept the ever-scrolling chat alight with activity. An email had been sitting in his streamer account's inbox for a few days. It was from a subscriber, but the name was an unfamiliar string of random characters. The message contained only a single file attachment named echo.exe, and a short, cryptic note: an exclusive beta. For you. There was no description, no screenshots, no developer website. It was a blank slate, a mystery box. In the world of content creation, where novelty was king, this was the perfect bait. He knew the risks of running an unknown executable, but the temptation of a true exclusive was too strong. He announced the unscheduled change of plans to his audience, framing it as a special treat, a journey into the unknown they would take together. The chat exploded in a waterfall of hype train emojis and question marks. He closed the game he had been playing and double-clicked the file, the tiny hourglass icon appearing for a brief, tense moment. He leaned back in his gaming chair, the familiar leather creaking under his weight. The main monitor flickered and went black for a second before a new image resolved itself out of the darkness. There were no menus, no logos, just a first-person view of a dark, shabby corridor. It was disappointingly banal. The textures were muddy, the lighting consisted of a single, flickering bulb overhead, and the sound design was a predictable loop of distant dripping and a low, ambient hum. For the first 15 minutes, he moved through the world with a lazy, almost bored precision. He was a veteran of 1,000 such hallways, an expert in the architecture of cheap horror. His commentary was laced with a gentle sarcasm, deconstructing the game's attempts at atmosphere before they could even land, pointing out the likely locations for the inevitable jump scares. His fingers moved across the keyboard with an effortless grace, his in-game character strafing around corners and checking empty rooms. "Okay, we've got a flickering light, a classic," he'd say into his microphone, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I'm betting 1,000 channel points there's a loud noise when I open this next door." He opened it, and a can slamming sound echoed through his headphones. See? Predictable. The chat loved it. They weren't just here for the scares, they were here for his mastery over them, for the way he tamed the horror and made it entertaining. He found a key, unlocked another section of identical-looking corridors, and continued his slow, unimpressed exploration. The game offered no story, no objective beyond simply moving forward. It felt less like a beta and more like a tech demo, a student project built from a generic horror asset pack. He was beginning to think the exclusive was a bust, a waste of a good streaming slot. He sighed, ready to tell his audience they'd been had, that it was time to move on to something else. But he decided to give it 5 more minutes, just long enough to round the next corner. He missed the first message in the chat. And the second. The feed was a river of text and emojis, a constant, flickering cascade that was impossible to follow word for word. But when a single phrase began to cut through the noise, spammed by dozens of different usernames, he couldn't help but notice. "The poster on the wall, that's the same one you have." Alex let out a short, dismissive chuckle, his eyes still glued to the game. Trolling. A classic community gag. "Yeah, right guys," he said into the mic, his voice dripping with amusement. "Very funny. I guess the developer is a big fan." But the messages didn't stop. They intensified, the same observation repeated with increasing urgency. "No, seriously, zoom in. It's the limited edition one from PAX East." Annoyed, but willing to play along with the bit for the sake of the stream, he maneuvered his in-game character to the wall where a faded, pixelated poster hung. It depicted a stylized knight standing over a dragon, the art style instantly recognizable. He physically leaned back in his chair to glance at the identical, real-life poster hanging over his own bed. It was a common enough print for a gaming fan. A coincidence? A lucky guess by the developer? Still, a tiny, nagging splinter of unease worked its way under his skin. He pushed it down and continued to play, but his movements were less certain now. He found himself entering another small, square room within the game, this one containing a desk and a chair. It was meant to be a save point, he assumed, or a place to find a clue. He approached the desk, the in-game camera panning across its surface. And that's when he saw it. In the corner of the virtual desk sat a mug. It was white, with a small, dark chip near the handle and a faint, brownish ring on its inner rim from an old coffee stain. His breath hitched in his throat. He slowly lowered his own hand, which had been holding his real-life mug, and placed it on his real-life desk beside his keyboard. It was the same mug. Not a similar one. The exact same one. The chip was in the same place, a tiny crescent-shaped flaw he knew intimately. The faint coffee stain was a mirror image of the one he'd failed to scrub out this morning. Time seemed to slow down. The roar of the chat, the hum of his computer, it all faded into a dull, distant buzz. There was only the mug on the screen and the mug on his desk, two impossible points of reality connected by a terrifying, inexplicable link. The dam of his disbelief broke, and a flood of cold dread washed over him. He was no longer playing a game. He was touring a replica. The chat, sensing the shift in his demeanor, went into a frenzy. They had been right all along. They were no longer trolls, they were his eyes, his chorus of terrified observers. "Look at the boxes," one message screamed. He forced his shaking hand to move the mouse, swiveling the character's view toward the corner of the room. There, in the game, was a messy pile of empty cardboard boxes. He didn't have to look to know they were there in his real room too, a monument to his recent hardware upgrades. The details kept coming, a relentless, horrifying avalanche of accuracy. "Your mic," someone typed. He looked at the virtual desk again. It wasn't a generic 3D model of a microphone. It was his microphone. A Shure SM7B, connected to a Rode PSA-1 boom arm, clamped to the desk in the exact same position. He could even see the way the XLR cable was loosely coiled and secured with a black zip tie, just as he had done it himself. This wasn't a lucky guess. This wasn't a coincidence. This was surveillance. This was a violation. His mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation. Had he been hacked? Was the beta some kind of sophisticated spyware that had activated his webcam, scanned his room, and was rendering it in real time? The idea was technologically plausible, but the implications were nauseating. Someone had been watching him. Not just his on-screen persona, the confident voidwalker, but Alex, the man in his private space. His room, his sanctuary, had been digitally catalogued and turned into a horror stage without his knowledge or consent. The game was no longer a source of entertainment, it was evidence of a crime. He began to methodically check every detail, his commentary for the stream ceasing entirely, replaced by a heavy, unnerving silence. He looked at the scuff mark on the wall behind his chair in the game, a dark smudge against the pale paint. He ran his hand over the identical, very real scuff mark on his own wall. He looked at the stack of old game cases on a shelf in the game, used as a makeshift stand. The top case was for a decade-old RPG he hadn't touched in years. He glanced at his real shelf. The same case was on top. Every single thing was perfect. The slight tear in the corner of his mousepad. The specific pattern of dust on an unused monitor. The way a charging cable snaked across the floor from the wall outlet to his desk. It was all there. A meticulous, flawless, and deeply terrifying digital recreation of his entire world. The banal corridors of the game's introduction now seemed like a distant memory, a clever misdirection to lull him into a false sense of security before the true nature of the horror was revealed. The monster wasn't a creature jumping out of the shadows. The monster was the game itself. He finally stopped his frantic comparisons, the character in the game standing perfectly still in the center of the virtual room. He was a prisoner in a digital diorama of his own life. The 10,000 viewers were no longer watching him play a game. They were watching him realize he was in one. The feeling of being watched had transformed. It was no longer the abstract pressure of a faceless audience. It was the pointed, specific, and malevolent gaze of the game's creator, someone who knew the chip on his mug and the dust on his shelves. And he had willingly, foolishly, invited them in. A cold prickle of sweat traced a path down his spine. The silence in the room was absolute, a stark contrast to the screaming chaos of the chat feed he was no longer reading. His mind, which had been racing through technological possibilities, hacking, augmented reality, sophisticated spyware, suddenly stalled. The sheer, obsessive perfection of the replica went beyond simple room scanning. This felt different. This felt personal. A hypothesis began to form in the back of his mind, a terrifying new theory that shifted the nature of his fear from a violation of privacy to a violation of physics. He had to test it. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand. The movement was measured, almost ceremonial. He kept his eyes locked on the screen, on the motionless avatar standing in the center of the digital room. With a trembling hand, he reached up and scratched the back of his neck, a nervous gesture he hadn't even been conscious of making. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The character on the screen remained still. A wave of relief washed over him. It was just a static, pre-rendered environment. A clever but lifeless imitation. He had been letting his imagination run away with him. And then the avatar moved. With the exact same slowness, the same measured deliberation, its digital arm rose. The pixelated hand reached up and scratched the back of its neck, mirroring his own gesture with a horrifying, one-to-one fidelity. The relief that had filled him moments before was instantly vaporized, replaced by a pure, undiluted adrenaline that made his heart hammer against his ribs. It wasn't just a model of his room. It was a live feed. A puppet. And he was the one pulling the strings, his own body the controller for this digital doppelganger in its virtual prison. He had to be sure. He had to push it. He jerked his head to the left, a sharp, sudden movement. The character's head snapped to the left in perfect synchronization. He leaned heavily to the right in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. The avatar mimicked the shift in weight, its posture changing instantly. He waved both hands in the air, a frantic, desperate gesture. On the screen, the digital arms flailed in perfect, terrifying unison. It was a shadow. A reflection in a cursed mirror. The lag was non-existent. The connection between his movements and the game's response was instantaneous, as if the digital and the physical were one and the same. The chat, which had been a chaotic mess of individual observations, now became a single, unified entity. A hive mind witnessing the impossible. The torrent of text transformed into a solid wall of shocked emojis and capitalized, single-word screams, "How? No way. What is this?" The messages flew by so fast they were an unreadable blur, a digital representation of a collective, global gasp. He was no longer just a streamer, he was the subject of an impossible phenomenon, and 10,000 people were his witnesses. The intimacy of the shared experience was gone, replaced by the feeling of being an exhibit, a specimen pinned to a board. He stopped moving, forcing his body into a rigid stillness, terrified of what another twitch or gesture might reveal. He sat bolt upright in his chair, his hands clamped to his desk, trying to sever the connection through sheer force of will. He stared at the screen, at his digital twin, which now also stood in perfect, rigid stillness. He was trapped in a feedback loop, a technological nightmare from which there was no apparent escape. He had to find a flaw, an inconsistency, a single detail that would prove this was a trick, a clever illusion, and not a fundamental break in the laws of reality. His eyes scanned the digital room, desperately searching for that flaw. He compared every pixel to its real-world counterpart, his gaze darting back and forth between his monitors and the physical space around him. The poster, the mug, the scuff mark, the cables, it was all perfect. There were no errors. The simulation was flawless. It was a perfect copy, a terrifyingly accurate echo of his world. And then his gaze fell upon the wall behind his in-game character. The wall that, in his real room, was a solid, unbroken expanse of pale paint, a place where he had a single, lonely hook for a guitar he rarely played. In the game, the wall was not solid. Set into the center of the digital wall was a door. It was not a modern door. It was old, made of dark, splintered wood, with a tarnished, ornate brass knob. It looked ancient, out of place, a relic from another century inserted into the meticulously modern recreation of his room. It was a detail that was aggressively, fundamentally wrong. It was the flaw he had been searching for, but its presence brought him no comfort. It was an anomaly, an impossibility, an addition to his world that he could not explain. It was a door that did not exist. His blood ran cold. He knew, with an instinct that defied logic, that this door was the entire point of the game. The replicated room, the mirrored movements, it was all just a stage, an elaborate setup to force his attention onto this single, impossible object. The banal corridors had led him to his room, and his room now contained a path to somewhere else. A cold, heavy dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He was not meant to be looking at the details he recognized. He was meant to be looking at the one thing he didn't. The one thing that shouldn't be there. He slowly, physically, turned his head to look at the real wall behind him. The wall was, of course, empty, just as it had always been. Pale paint, the single guitar hook. No door. He turned back to the screen. The dark, wooden door was still there, a silent, menacing presence in the virtual space. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, drawing his eye, commanding his focus. It was a question mark made of wood and brass. A silent invitation to an unknown destination. It was the only escape from the perfect prison of his room, and he was terrified to even consider what lay behind it. And at that exact moment, as if a switch had been flipped, the chaotic, screaming wall of text in his chat feed coalesced into a single, coherent thought. The disparate voices of thousands of strangers, scattered all across the globe, united as one. One after another, then in dozens, then in hundreds, they all typed the same 3 words, over and over, until the chat was nothing but a solid, scrolling column of a single, terrifying command. A command directed not at the character on the screen, but at him. At Alex. The hive mind had seen the door, and it was telling him what to do. Look behind you. A sharp, barking laugh escaped his lips. The sound was harsh and unnatural in the tense silence of the room, a desperate attempt to shatter the spell that had fallen over him. He forced a smile, turning his face toward the small, unblinking eye of his webcam. He had to regain control. The fear was a living thing, coiling in his gut, but he couldn't let it show. Not to them. He was Voidwalker, the unflappable master of horror. He was the one who laughed at jump scares, not the one who became one. This was his show, his stage, and he would not be upstaged by a clever piece of code. Okay, you got me, he said, his voice a little too high, a little too strained. He ran a hand through his hair, a classic stalling gesture. This is impressive. Seriously. He needed to construct a narrative, a rational explanation that would reassert his dominance over the situation. It was a joke. That was it. A brilliant, technologically advanced, and incredibly elaborate practical joke. He had to frame it that way, not as a genuine mystery, but as a masterful piece of interactive art that he was privileged to experience. It was the only way to save face. His mind scrambled to build the theory, his words tumbling out as he formulated the thoughts. Someone, some genius developer out there, has been watching the stream, he began, trying to sound more impressed than terrified. They've used some kind of advanced photogrammetry, maybe through my webcam feed, to build a 3D model of my room. He nodded, as if confirming the idea to himself. And the motion controls, it has to be some kind of real-time body tracking. Augmented reality, neural networks, something cutting edge. It's incredible. He was building a wall of jargon, a fortress of technological buzzwords to hide behind. The door. He had to explain the door. It was the centerpiece of the illusion, the one element that didn't fit the room scanning theory. He couldn't ignore it. And the door, he continued, forcing another chuckle, that's the chef's kiss. The perfect horror trope. The one thing that doesn't belong, designed to get a rise out of me. He pointed a finger at the webcam, trying to create a sense of camaraderie with the invisible prankster. Well, congratulations, mystery dev. You did it. You officially created the most personalized horror experience ever. I'm impressed. You win the internet for tonight. The performance was draining him, but he had to see it through. He needed to be the one to end the stream, to pull the plug on the experiment. to quit now would be to admit defeat, to concede that he was genuinely scared. He had to frame it as the natural conclusion of the show, a bit that had run its course. "All right, chat," he said, turning his attention back to the monitor. "As amazing as this is, I think it's time to shut it down before this thing becomes self-aware and starts demanding union wages." He tried for a joke, but it landed flat, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He reached for his mouse, his hand hovering over it for a moment. This was the moment of truth. Closing the program would prove it was just a program. It would break the spell and return his room to being just a room. The simple act of clicking the X in the corner of the window had become a monumental act of defiance, a reassertion of his control over his own digital space. His fingers were slick with a cold sweat as they closed around the smooth plastic. He was Voidwalker. He was the one who ended the games. The games did not end him. His gaze flickered back to the screen, to the silent, waiting avatar in its perfect prison. The dark, wooden door behind it seemed to loom larger now, a silent rebuke to his rationalizations. His technological explanation felt thin, flimsy, a story he was telling himself because the alternative was unthinkable. Could a webcam really capture the specific coffee stain inside his mug? Could it replicate the exact tear in his mousepad, a flaw that was mostly hidden from view? Could any software, no matter how advanced, achieve this level of flawless, instantaneous mirroring? A sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through his carefully constructed bravado. The chat was still a solid wall of "look behind you," a hypnotic, relentless chant that was beginning to feel less like a suggestion and more like an incantation. They weren't in on the joke. They were true believers in the horror. For them, this was real. For a terrifying, fleeting moment, he wondered if they were right. What if it wasn't a prank? What if the door wasn't just a clever bit of code? What if, when he clicked the mouse to close the program, nothing happened? He shook his head, a physical gesture to dislodge the irrational thought. It was a game. An executable file. It had a process ID, it was using memory and CPU cycles. It was a tangible piece of software that could be terminated. He had to believe that. He had to hold on to that one, simple, logical fact. His entire sense of reality now hinged on the ability of his operating system to perform a force quit. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air burning in his lungs. He was in control. He would prove it to them. He would prove it to himself. His finger tightened on the mouse button, the microswitch poised to click. He aimed the cursor at the top right corner of the game window, a small beacon of control in a sea of digital chaos. This was it. The end of the show. He would click the button, the window would close, and he would spend the rest of the night laughing about the most elaborate troll in the history of streaming. He would be a legend. The streamer who was so dedicated, he became the star of his own, personal horror game. It was a good story. A safe story. He just had to make it true. The click was a promise of a return to normalcy. The cursor froze. He had moved the mouse, a frantic, desperate slide across the surface of his mousepad, but the white arrow on the screen remained stubbornly, defiantly still. It was locked in place, a tiny icon of his powerlessness. The connection between his physical actions and the digital world had been severed. Or rather, it had been reclaimed. The game had taken back control. A new, deeper cold, far worse than the creeping dread he had felt before, began to seep into his bones. His carefully constructed wall of rationalizations crumbled into dust, leaving him exposed and utterly vulnerable. He frantically clicked the mouse buttons, the sharp, plastic sounds echoing in the silent room like a panicked heartbeat. Nothing. He tried to Alt-Tab, to bring up the task manager, to perform any action that would prove his computer still belonged to him. The machine was completely unresponsive. It was no longer his tool, it had become a cage, a window into a world that was now operating under its own set of rules. The stream was still running, his camera was still live, but he was no longer the director of the show. He was just the main attraction, a helpless exhibit for 10,000 unseen eyes. On the screen, the avatar, his digital shadow, also broke free. It was no longer mirroring his movements. While he sat frozen in a rictus of terror, the character on the screen moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly alien. The link was broken. It was no longer his puppet. It was an independent entity, and it was now in control of the simulation. He watched, a helpless spectator, as the character, with a sickeningly fluid motion, turned away from him. It was no longer interested in him. It had its own agenda now, its own destination within the confines of the replicated room. The avatar walked slowly toward the wall opposite the impossible door. In his real room, this wall was dominated by a large window that looked out onto the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. He had always found the view comforting, a reminder of the vast, living world outside his small, isolated space. He expected the game to have replicated this window, to show a pixelated version of the familiar skyline. But as the character approached the wall, he realized with a fresh wave of nausea that there was no city. There was no night sky. The window did not look out. It looked in. Behind the glass of the virtual window was not a cityscape, but another screen. The image it displayed was low resolution, slightly pixelated, but it was undeniably, horrifyingly familiar. It was a live feed of his own stream. He was looking at a digital recreation of himself, sitting in his real chair, staring at his real monitor, his face a pale, ghostly mask illuminated by the screen's glow. It was a dizzying, recursive nightmare, a digital hall of mirrors that seemed to stretch into infinity. He was watching a game that was, in turn, watching him. The predator had become the prey. The chat feed was visible in the virtual window, a tiny, scrolling column of text within the game's world. He could see the frantic cascade of messages, the endless stream of screaming emojis and panicked questions. The audience was no longer just watching him, they were now a part of the set dressing, an element of the horror landscape that the game was presenting back to him. They were trapped in the loop with him, their terrified reactions now a permanent part of the game's aesthetic. The fourth wall had not just been broken, it had been atomized. He felt a profound sense of disconnection from his own body. He was an observer, watching the horror unfold on multiple layers of reality. He watched himself on the stream, a terrified man losing his grip. He watched the avatar in the game, an autonomous entity exploring its prison. And he watched the chat, a digital Greek chorus narrating the descent into madness. The game was no longer just a reflection of his room, it was a reflection of his entire reality as a streamer, a twisted, malevolent parody of the world he had built for himself. The character on the screen stood before the virtual window for a long moment, its back to him, forcing him to look at the reflection of his own terror. It was as if the game was holding up a mirror and demanding he confront the pathetic, frightened man he had become. The confident, charismatic Voidwalker was gone, replaced by this pale, wide-eyed effigy, a deer caught in the headlights of an onrushing, incomprehensible horror. The game was not just a prank, it was a judgment. It had peeled back his online persona and exposed the raw, quivering fear beneath. He tried to speak, to say something to his audience, to scream for help, but his throat was tight with a fear so profound it had stolen his voice. He was utterly silent, a prisoner in his own body, just as his avatar was a prisoner in its digital room. The only sounds were the frantic clicking of his own useless mouse and the low hum of the computer that was now holding him hostage. He had willingly downloaded this program, invited this entity into his home, and it had, in turn, consumed his entire world, turning it into a self-contained, self-referential nightmare. The game was in control now. It had established its dominance, proven its power. It had shown him that his reality was its plaything. And now, its silent contemplation of his terror was over. The avatar, its purpose at the window fulfilled, began to move again. It turned away from the screen within a screen, its movements slow and deliberate. It turned to face him once more, its featureless face seeming to stare directly through the monitor, its gaze piercing through the layers of digital artifice to lock onto his very soul. And then, it began to walk toward the other wall. The wall with the door. The avatar turned away from the window screen. Its movements were no longer fluid, they were heavy, deliberate, as if it were pushing against some unseen pressure. It turned its blank face toward him, a digital effigy now imbued with a terrifying, undeniable purpose. It was not looking at the webcam. It was looking through the monitor, its gaze a tangible force that seemed to pin him to his chair. The game was done playing with reflections. The final act was about to begin. The character stood motionless for a beat, a silent herald of the inevitable, its very stillness a screaming threat. Then, behind the character, in the game, the impossible door began to move. It didn't swing open suddenly. It opened with an agonizing slowness, the dark, splintered wood groaning in protest. The sound that emanated from his headphones was a masterclass in audio design, a low, guttural creak of old, stressed timber that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. It was the sound of something ancient and long sealed being disturbed. As the door swung inward, it revealed nothing but a perfect, absolute, and impenetrable darkness. It was not the absence of light, it was a presence of blackness, a void that seemed to suck the very color from the pixels around it. At the exact same instant, the sound came from behind him. It was not a digital echo from his speakers. It was a real, physical, and utterly impossible sound that originated from the solid wall directly behind his chair. It was the same sound. The exact same low, protracted, soul-chilling creak of ancient wood. The perfect acoustics of his soundproofed room allowed no ambiguity. The sound was in the room with him. A sound that had no source. A sound that should not exist. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locked in a state of pure, primal terror. His carefully constructed reality, already fractured, now shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He didn't dare to turn around. He couldn't. His neck was locked, his gaze fixed on the screen in a paralysis of disbelief and horror. To turn around would be to acknowledge the impossible, to confirm that the barrier between the digital and the physical had been completely and irrevocably erased. To turn around would be to see the door that he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, was now standing open in the solid wall behind him. The chat's hypnotic chant of, "Look behind you," was no longer a taunt, it was a prophecy that had just been fulfilled. The game had not just replicated his room, it had edited it. His breath was a ragged, shallow gasp in his throat. He was no longer a streamer, no longer a person. He was pure sensory input, an organism reacting to a stimulus it could not comprehend. He could feel a change in the air behind him, a subtle shift in pressure, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. It was the feeling of a space long enclosed being open to the world, the stale, cold air of a tomb spilling out into his room. The darkness he saw on the screen was not just a visual representation. He could feel its presence at his back, a cold, silent weight in the room. On the screen, the avatar stood aside from the now open doorway, as if making way for something. It turned its head, its blank face looking back at him one last time. It was an invitation. A final, silent command to witness the conclusion. He was the audience for this final act, his reaction the only thing that mattered. His eyes, wide with a terror that was beyond screaming, were reflected in the dark glass of the monitor. He saw a man on the brink of madness, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of horror. He was looking at his own breaking point, broadcast live to the world. And the world was watching. The viewers in the chat saw it all. They saw the moment the sound registered, the way his body went rigid, the sudden, wild dilation of his pupils. They saw the terror that was not a performance, the raw, unfiltered fear of a man confronting the impossible. They saw his composure, his entire online persona, disintegrate in real time. They saw the mask of Voidwalker fall away to reveal the terrified face of Alex, a man who had strayed too far into the darkness and had found something waiting for him. And then, just as a low, guttural sound finally began to form in his throat, a sound that was half a word and half a sob, the screen went black. The feed was cut. The stream ended with an abrupt, jarring finality. One moment, he was there, a portrait of pure terror. The next, there was only a loading icon and the offline message. The 10,000 viewers were left staring at a dead screen, the final image of his horrified face burned into their minds. They were left with the echo of that impossible, synchronous sound, and a single, unanswerable question that would haunt them for nights to come: where, exactly, did the game end, and where did the recording begin?